China's designs to dominate on the world stage. Good evening and welcome to the special edition of Faith Nation from our news bureau in Washington. I'm John Jessup. Well, for the past 20 years, a strategic threat has been growing in our own backyard. While the United States was focused on other parts of the world, China has been burrowing its way into South America, becoming a leading trade partner on the continent. And with more socialist leaders coming into power, the region is drifting in an anti-American direction. CBN's Dale Hurd has more in tonight's top story.
A Chinese TV show teaches the latest Latin dance moves. The Chinese have a new interest in all things Latin American these days because China is now the dominant power in the region. This shows the extent of China's trade dominance in South America in 2000. Compare that to what it is today. And China is well on its way to becoming the dominant trading partner in all of Latin America. Latin American officials are warning that the U.S. is losing the region to China without a fight.
It is a big problem, and it's a problem that's getting worse.
Dr. Evan Ellis is a Latin American expert at the U.S. Army War College.
For China, in Latin America, like most other parts of the world, it's mostly economic, but that doesn't make it any the less strategic either for the United States or the region.
20 Latin American nations have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, in which China invests in a nation's infrastructure, like this container port China is building for Peru. China will also be supplying nations with civilian nuclear technology, helping them develop space programs, and providing them with Chinese 5G technology that experts warn is a surveillance tool of the Chinese military. Several nations have received Chinese loans. Ecuador is so deep in debt to the communist government, it's asked Beijing to renegotiate the terms.
They orchestrate those loans and those contracts in ways to make sure that they get paid. And Chinese banks oftentimes operate more as loan sharks. In other words, give me the title to your car, so to speak.
In addition to making money, China expands its political influence. Taiwan used to be the dominant Asian trading partner in Latin America. Now, most of the nations in the region have flipped their allegiance to communist China. At the same time, a leftist populist wave is sweeping through Latin American politics. Most of the governments now range from center-left to Marxist, with Brazil and Colombia both at risk of also falling to the left in coming elections.
Were that to happen, you would essentially have the entirety of Latin America in the hands of not just leftists, not just socialists, but really radicals and communists in quite a number of cases.
China is also establishing a growing number of Confucius institutes in the region, school programs that teach young people Chinese language and culture and push Chinese government propaganda. Ellis says China is also cultivating military ties here, which it could use in any future conflict with the United States.
So, for example, if war ever broke out over Taiwan, they would probably not make it a war that was fought just in Asia. It's entirely possible that there would be certain anti-U.S. states in the region that might welcome China in.
The White House claims it can win back the region with its Build Back Better World initiative. What the U.S. cannot do, says Ellis, is tell Latin American nations who they can and cannot trade with.
The United States doesn't have a lot of great options. It's very difficult for us to try to block sovereign nations from realizing commerce with another power. It only creates resentment. It's very difficult for the United States to provide alternatives to massive amounts of Chinese aid and investment.
But the U.S. has to do something because America faces a new strategic threat in this hemisphere.
We need to be acting on the principle that what happens in our hemisphere is of vital interest to our country. It's not just our backyard, I would argue it's our front yard.
Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Fishermen under fire. Why they're coming in the crosshairs of China's Maritime Militia in the South China Sea. We explain right after this. Welcome back. Domination of the South China Sea. It's a major goal of Beijing, and over the last decade, the communist regime has deployed significant military assets to achieve that end, intimidating any country using the key international shipping lane. Now, fishermen whose livelihoods depend on the waterway are caught in the crosshairs. CBN's George Thomas brings us the first-hand story of their struggles from Manila.
Spend any amount of time with JC Cabanillas on the water, and you'll soon discover what puts a smile on his face.
I feel the happiest when I'm at sea. This is the kind of job where you don't have a boss. It's based on your decision whether you'll go to sea or not.
3 generations of Cabanillas' family have fished these waters here off the Philippine coast. That livelihood now faces an increasing threat from China.
Every time Filipino fishermen go to the West Philippine Sea, they will be greeted by Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese fishermen. No matter how far they are, they will be reminded that you have entered Chinese territory, so you have to leave.
Fernando Haicap runs the nation's largest fishing federation, some 80,000 members. He says that China's claim to South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea, puts fishermen like Cabanillas on the front lines of a possible military confrontation with Beijing.
Before the occupation of the Chinese government in the West Philippine Sea and larger South China Sea, area used to be a fishing ground for all fishermen from different countries: Malaysians, Indonesians, Vietnamese, Taiwanese, and Chinese. During that time, there were no stories of fights or rivalry between the fishermen. But now, the Chinese presence is so destructive.
The Philippine government warned world leaders at the recent Munich Security Conference that China's harassment of Filipino fishermen and the country's Coast Guard is now a daily occurrence.
It's clear to us what China wants. They want to occupy the West Philippine Sea and the whole South China Sea.
A Chinese Coast Guard ship hit a Philippine Coast Guard vessel last month with a military-grade laser, temporarily blinding some of the crew aboard the Philippine vessel. Several Filipino fishermen were also targeted and forced to move away from the area. The Philippine government lodged more than 200 protests against Chinese intimidation and harassment in 2022 alone. JC here has been fishing these waters off the coast of the Philippines for more than 35 years. And today, so many of his colleagues who fish these same waters are urging the Filipino government to do more to challenge the Chinese. To avoid direct military confrontation and still maintain a high level of intimidation, the Chinese government has deployed a maritime militia, mostly made up of commercial Chinese fishermen, to prowl these waters.
They are trained by the PLA Navy, and their wages are funded by the PLA Navy.
Retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster, a former director of operations at the U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center, says the militia has hundreds of commercial boats and thousands of crew members at their disposal.
The advantage of using the maritime militia is ostensibly they are commercial craft. If you check the ownership papers, they go back to a commercial entity somewhere, and that gives the Chinese government plausible deniability.
In 2021, more than 200 Chinese fishing boats converged on the Whitsun Reef, an area under Philippine control in the South China Sea.
Their basic tactics is to intimidate local fishermen into leaving the area so that China gains control of the waters by default.
The militia, dubbed as China's Little Blue Men because of the blue-painted color of their vessels, are trained to carry out offensive maneuvers, especially around disputed territories.
It's called gray zone operations. They stop short of committing an act of war, but they will use their water cannon on local fishing boats. They'll bump them, ram them, sink them, and then leave them.
Experts say China's hybrid warfare here is similar to how Moscow deployed its Russian Little Green Men to infiltrate and take over Crimea in 2014.
And in theory, they could do even more than that. If they ever wanted to launch an attack, they could even use some fishing boats clandestinely or surreptitiously to carry weapons or carry soldiers.
It's one big reason why the Philippines and neighboring countries are reluctant to openly challenge the Chinese on the high seas.
When they come up on one of these craft violating local rules, are they approaching a purely commercial craft or are they approaching an armed ship? Nations, particularly in Southeast Asia, where China is much more powerful than they are, they're very wary of interfering with any Chinese commercial fishing activity for fear of what they might actually be encountering.
Back on his boat, J.C. Cabanillas is thrilled that the United States and the Philippines are strengthening their military ties. Both countries are set to resume joint patrols of the South China Sea.
We Filipinos need to stay strong as well, so that the Chinese will see we're not scared of them. The more we look intimidated, the more they want to occupy us.
George Thomas, CBN News, Manila.
Great reporting. Thank you, George. Well, coming up, how a change in immigration policy isn't stopping the flow of immigrants, rather sparking more caravans along a dangerous route to the U.S. southern border.
I am Region's first ROTC graduate student.
Nearly 250,000 men, women, and children from 150 countries traveled through a deadly region known as the Darien Gap in Panama last year. That figure highlights a massive spike of migrants heading to America from around the world. You'd think American officials would try to shut down the dangerous route, but as Chuck Holton reports, they're making changes that will bring even more people from places like China.
Not long after sunup, on the steamy Panamanian side of the Darien Gap, dugout canoes make their way downriver to a tiny Indian village. The dugouts aren't carrying locals, however. They're packed with migrants from all over the world whose destination is the U.S. southern border. Recent policy changes by the Biden administration allow 120,000 migrants per month to skip this challenging trek by pre-registering using a new mobile app. Even so, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas maintains the goal is not to stop migrants from entering the U.S.
What we're trying to do is, and more broadly, incentivize a safe and orderly way and cut out the smuggling organizations. And I've seen the criticism of it as a ban, but it is not a ban at all.
Since the new policy only covers Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, migrants from other countries now fill these routes. The migrants that are coming into Puerto Limon here are the lucky ones. They're the ones that had a little more money and were able to take the shorter route through the jungle that only took 3 or 4 days instead of 6 days or more. These tend to be more from places outside the Western Hemisphere, places like China, Afghanistan, India, places like that. We're going to go down and talk to some right now. Many Chinese people said they decided to come now because of their country's harsh zero-COVID policy. Somalia?
Mauritania.
Mauritania. Wow. Yeah. Somalia? Wow. Among those arriving at Puerto Limon this day included 2 American journalists, Ben Berquam and Oscar Ramirez. They'd just followed the migrant trail all the way from Colombia, walking 3.5 days through the jungle.
As we're heading out, we see the same group stuck here, waiting to figure out what to do. Ask them what happened to their guide.
¿Qué les pasó con el guía? It was way harder than what I thought that it was going to be. On the first day, it was really hard. We got a little bit lost right there in the second day, so we had a bad track that was double the effort. And on the third day, we were exhausted. A lot of the people were dehydrated. We saw a lot of migrants dehydrated, so it was really bad.
He's not exaggerating. Yet Colombian smugglers are using videos like these to advertise in China, making the trek seem like a fun and easy hike in the woods. Chinese pay smugglers up to $20,000 per person, although the true cost is measured in misery.
It is completely destroying the environment. It is risking their lives. It is risking child's lives. It's human torture, what they're doing, and they're abusing people. That is the most shocking thing for me, that they put a human being through that, and they're promoting that. It's really false advertisement, what they're doing.
Second Lieutenant Vicente Guerra and his team of Senafront Border Police regularly recover bodies of those who die of heat stroke or drown during river crossings.
The dangers these migrants face are enormous because they have no experience surviving in the jungle. Others bring children through this. It's a whole different level of risk they are taking. We carry everything we need in case we have to spend the night in the jungle. These people have nothing.
On this trip, the Senafront team accompanied Ben and Oscar on their journey, making careful notes and keeping an eye out for the bandits known to prey on migrants. After experiencing it for themselves, the journalists had a clear message.
People should look for another routes for people to migrate, or a safe way or a safe pathway for people to go through another place if they want to migrate. But the Darien, no.
Don't come. Don't put your kids through this. Don't put yourself through this. Don't be raped. Don't be robbed. Don't be murdered by the cartels.
From Panama, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Coming up, an unauthorized police station, or police stations rather, run by the Chinese Communist Party. You'll be surprised to learn where and why they haven't been shut down. Next.
Young people, millennials, are flocking to church.
It's not an exaggeration to say that we love to meet them and that we love to know their stories.
A network of Chinese agents is at work right here in America. Their mission? To hunt down, intimidate, and in some cases, kill pro-democracy dissidents. In cities across the United States and around the world, Chinese agents operate out of so-called police stations where the familiar call to serve and protect is not their chief aim. Here again, Dale Hurd.
Above this noodle shop in New York's Chinatown, agents of the Chinese Communist government operated an overseas police station for years. There are more than 100 of them worldwide. They don't usually look like a police station. They may only be back rooms, but they're staffed by Chinese government officials. The police stations, along with so-called aid stations across the U.S., are used by the Chinese government to harass and threaten pro-democracy Chinese immigrants to stop speaking out against the regime and go back to China, even kidnapping them if necessary. One of their targets is Li Jianji, a pro-democracy activist who was tortured repeatedly in Chinese psychiatric hospitals before he was able to flee to the U.S., where the persecution has continued. Xi, who does not speak English, told us Chinese government hitmen in the Los Angeles area have tried to kill him 3 times, twice with a car and once by stabbing him in the neck, calling him a traitor as they fled the scene. Chinese government agents and supporters regularly film and disrupt pro-democracy demonstrations in American cities. They warn activists they're being reported to Beijing and that their family back home will be arrested. The world has known about these police stations for many months now. A key question for the U.S. government is why almost nothing has been done about it. A recent New York Times report made it look like the FBI is on the case, highlighting a raid on that Chinese police station in New York's Chinatown. But that raid happened last fall, and the FBI didn't shut it down, it only gathered evidence. When we asked the FBI if it's closed any of the Chinese police stations across the U.S. or brought charges against anyone, it declined comment, saying that FBI Director Christopher Wray's testimony to the Senate Homeland Security Committee last year would serve as the agency's statement on the matter.
We are aware of the existence of these stations. I had to be careful about discussing our specific investigative work, but suffice to say, I can tell you from an FBI director perspective, I'm deeply concerned about this, and I'm not going to just let it lie.
Laura Harth, with the Spanish group that uncovered the extent of these overseas police stations, says it's been a struggle to get governments to do anything about it.
I don't think most of them knew about the police stations, obviously. That's clear from their response. Obviously, we had a response in the US, we had some response in Australia. some in Canada, where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police head came out saying, oh, yes, we know that this is an issue, we will act on it. Yet nothing happened.
Chinese democracy activist Jingyu Wang is a U.S. resident now living under police protection in the Netherlands, where Chinese agents have repeatedly harassed and threatened him. He was in prison for 2 months in Dubai at the request of Chinese authorities and has had to fight off a knife attack in the Netherlands.
How can I help you? Why you call me?
This is a phone call he recorded from the Chinese embassy in Norway, saying he's been reported to police as having a bomb. The Chinese government has imprisoned his parents to force him to return to China.
They asked me go to Rotterdam, Chinese overseas police station for surrender, and they asked me go back to China. They asked me thinking about my parents from 2022 February to 2022, I think, April. Almost every day they will make over 100 phone call to me. Every day, like 3 a.m., 4 a.m., keep make phone call to me.
These overseas police stations are only one part of a massive campaign to control Chinese citizens living in other nations. The communist government has also used what it calls Operation Fox Hunt and Skynet to apprehend citizens abroad under the guise of stopping financial crimes.
So the police stations are really just the tip of the iceberg of what we're looking at when we talk about the transnational repression and policing campaigns coming from the Chinese Communist Party to return people to China at all costs, by all means.
Harth says the Chinese government has reportedly forced the return of an incredible 230,000 Chinese back to the mainland between 2021 and last year.
The CCP is attempting to impose its control in every country around the world.
China expert Bradley Thayer believes one reason for the lack of action by the Justice Department has been a failure by American leaders to face up to the China threat.
The lack of responsiveness regarding the China threat is something which has plagued us for decades. This lack of concern which plagues the American elite, and that would be universities, media, so many of our political leaders, Wall Street, Silicon Valley.
The FBI recently asked the Chinese American community to report any harassment by Chinese government agents, which Thayer agreed was odd since the FBI, with its vast spying powers, probably knows who the agents are. Li Jianji wishes the FBI would do something. He told us he reported the attempts against his life to the FBI, but it never responded. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
An important story to tell. Well, that is our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you right back here next time.